elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody. Today, we're talking about a hot topic that, over the years, as I've waded into this issue, it's really interesting to see where people fall. This is Connor, joined by Brian here for episode 114 of the podcast. We're joined today by Hannah Cox. She's National Manager of Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. Hannah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So this is an interesting topic that I myself have had a progression or an open mind on over the years and kind of changed my position. I imagine a lot of our listeners are perhaps in that same transition. Let's maybe start with the easier questions, and then we can get into more detail if we want. So obviously today we're talking about whether or not the death penalty should be abolished, whether we need to put a stop to it, what are the concerns about it. And so let's maybe start at a high level, Hannah, and talk about why the death penalty exists. How is it being used? And maybe in that answer you can begin to talk about why how it's being used is a problem for you guys.
Sure, and I'm very similar to you, as I've been on a progression about this issue for quite some time now. I used to be very pro-death penalty when I first was entering politics and getting involved in criminal justice reform. And the problems with the system are in the way that it's being implemented right now. When you start digging in, you think that, I think most people have a perception that it's the most heinous of crimes that are getting this, right, that it's solely reserved for the worst of the worst. And when you really start looking at it, it actually is based a lot more on geography than it is on the type of crime that you're committing. We found that the majority of death penalty cases right now come from only 2% of counties. And for all the executions that the country has had since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, all of those executions have stemmed from only 15% of counties. Now, that's problematic because the first time that the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, it was done so because they found that it was a cruel lottery, that it was not being allocated in a way that actually made any sort of rhyme or reason or sense, and that it was causing a lot of disparities in who was getting it. And so it was banned for quite some time in the U.S. before it came back. Unfortunately, that's continuing to take place in this time, too.
That's super interesting. And so I want to start, I came across this quote a few years ago by John Adams. So listeners may recall that he passionately defended the British soldiers who were charged with murder in their connection with the Boston Massacre. And so when he was speaking to the jury, he addressed this famous doctrine that was established by the English jurist William Blackstone. We now call it Blackstone's Law. Better that 10 guilty people go free than that one innocent person be punished. So here's what Adams said. He says, it's more important that innocence should be protected than it is that guilt should be punished. For guilt and crimes are so frequent in this world that all of them cannot be punished. But when innocence itself is brought to the bar and condemned, especially to die, the subject will exclaim, the subject meaning the person, will exclaim, it is immaterial to me whether I behave well or ill, for virtue itself is no security. In other words, I've been virtuous, I'm innocent, and yet that hasn't been security to me. So then Adams finishes, and if such a sentiment as this should take place in the mind of the subject, the person, there would be an end to all security whatsoever. This kind of frames the questions, at least I'd like to ask you. I'm sure Brian has plenty of his own, but to me, the thing that brought me to open my mind towards a reconsideration of the death penalty was this notion of learning that it is not only guilty people that are being punished. As you point out, there's a geographical thing going on here, which is very compelling to say this is not some kind of, unanimous thing. It's not, everyone's not doing it. Everyone hasn't bought into the same idea and is using it appropriately and equally. So that's one issue. But to me, the most compelling issue, and tell me if you disagree or what your own thoughts on this, Hannah, are, the very fact that innocent people have been executed and can and will in the future be executed, to me, undermines the entire proposition. What are your thoughts?
I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head, and that was one of the first things that got my attention when I started looking into the death penalty issue, were the amount of innocence claims that were found within it. We've had 162 people that have been exonerated from death row and counting, and that continues to grow every year. That might sound like a small number, but when you look at the fact that we've only had about 1,400 executions in this country since the death penalty was reinstated, that equals about one person released over innocence issues for every 10 executions we've had in this country. So I think for people like you and I who have this concept of our justice system that's really grounded in what our founding fathers intended and in what I think is paramount to the country's success, when you think that that's how the justice system's operating and then you are confronted with the fact that it's absolutely not, and we are for sure incarcerating and at times executing innocent people, I think that has to apply a lot of weight to the way anybody approaches this issue.
Now, Hannah, I'm going to link to this on our show notes page, which is societyandthestate.com/114. I imagine you've heard about this. I'd love your reaction to it, because as we're talking about how this works, how innocent people can be condemned and executed, I'm reminded one of many examples. This happened in 2015, and again, we'll link to this for those who want to learn more. The FBI admitted that consistently flawed testimony provided by its agents had overstated or outright falsified the accuracy of forensic evidence that was used in 95% of criminal cases that investigators had reviewed from a period spanning more than 2 decades. So they review all these cases. They find that the FBI had exaggerated or outright lied about bite mark analysis and hair, and that testimony was crucial in many of these cases towards securing a conviction and ultimately executing the person. This included 32 defendants sentenced to death, 14 of which had already been executed. So I read this and I think, holy cow, 14 people have died. And maybe they were guilty. Maybe it's not that just because the FBI had misstated or lied in that case that the person, wasn't in fact guilty. But when these cases are resting on this forensic evidence, and that's what the jury relies upon, you got to think, and I think the implication here absolutely is that many of these people were actually innocent, but they were condemned to die by fatally flawed FBI evidence, or rather testimony. What's your reaction to that, Hannah?
Yeah, I think that, and I'm sure you're familiar with this term, but we have something going on in the criminal justice system that people inside of it call the CSI Effect, and it refers to the multiple issues with forensic science that are happening within the system. First and foremost, I think something that's shocking to most people is how seldom we actually have concrete DNA evidence available in a case. I think if you watch Law & Order or CSI, you think there's just DNA everywhere. It's actually only present in about 5 to 10% of cases at most. On top of that, typically when we see forensic evidence introduced, juries have become so conditioned to its foolproofness that they tend to believe it no matter what. So they don't tend to ask a lot of questions about the chain of evidence or how the testing was done. You also see a lot of problems with labs being paid on convictions, and so you have an incentive for them to produce results. So we have a system that is really seeking convictions and not the truth, and I think that's absolutely evident when you look at the amount of people who have had innocence issues. I think there's about 45% of those cases have involved misapplication of forensic science. Not to mention that many types of DNA evidence, once considered foolproof, like what you mentioned with ballistic missile testing, microscopic hair analysis, bite mark evidence, many of these things were once considered absolutely foolproof and have since been completely debunked. And so you've got this massive problem with how our criminal justice system approaches forensic science. And I think it certainly ends up where a lot of people are wrongfully convicted. We can see it also exonerate people and help prove their innocence as well. But the incentives within the criminal justice system are not structured to where the people prosecuting these cases are encouraged to be looking for the truth. It's typically people working outside of the system with groups like the Innocence Project and Witness to Innocence and many others who are volunteering and spending their time to reprocess information and actually find out people who have been wrongfully convicted.
Hannah, as I'm hearing you and Connor discuss this, it seems I've followed a pretty similar track as the two of you. There was a time when I really believed that our government was the best source, the most likely source for justice to happen. Now I think justice tends to serve the interests of the state. Who benefits when the government is firmly, entrenched in dispensing what it's calling justice, including the death penalty? Who fights for that power to remain with government because it would benefit them?
Well, it's typically the prosecutors. DA's conferences get very involved in any kind of criminal justice reforms at the state level and trying to push different legislative initiatives. I think that as a whole, it obviously benefits the prosecutor's office and also the police departments to have a person to have a conviction to get people off the streets who people consider dangerous. That helps them look like they're doing their jobs in the communities, makes people in the communities feel safer. And so I think the incentive to just get somebody is much stronger than it is to ensure that you're getting the right person.
Hannah, along those lines, we're talking about law enforcement. One of the things that struck me, I'll also link to this on the show notes page, societyandthestate.com/114, was a national survey of police chiefs. And this was done in part to understand this supposed deterrent effect. People claim that, well, we need the death penalty because if we don't have that strong deterrent in place, then it's going to undermine our ability to basically send a warning message to would-be criminals of these heinous crimes that, if you commit this murder or whatever, you're going to be executed. If we lack that deterrent, if all we tell these people is, oh, we're going to lock you in prison, that's not going to have the same deterrent effect. And this national survey found that law enforcement executives ranked the death penalty last as a way of reducing violent crime, and rated it as the least cost-effective method for controlling crime. So when you hear people use this argument, Hannah, that, well, we need this because it's a deterrent, what's your response that you typically give?
I think that it's easy to understand why people would assume that it's a deterrent. You would think that people would stop and think about the consequences before they act. However, data does not show that that is how a criminal acts. Typically, someone who is committing a murder is acting at a time of passion, and they are not thinking about the consequences down the road. The same report that you mentioned, that the ranked the chiefs of police opinions, also said that chiefs of police do not believe that criminals think before they act, or they think about the consequences before they act. And so, first and foremost, it doesn't deter anyone from acting. Second of all, I think the problem is that you see a lot of money going in to pursue the death penalty, and this differs state to state, but we know it's about at least $2 million more per case than pursuing something like life in prison without parole. Well, what that means is not only are you spending a vast amount of tax dollars on these cases trying to pursue death sentences over, decades, it means that you're also giving up a lot of opportunity costs within that, where you are taking up resources from police departments, from prosecutors' office, you're taking up law enforcement time, and you are devoting it to pursuing death sentences for a few hand-picked number of cases, while the majority of cases are actually allowed to go unsolved. A recent report that looked at 50 cities over the past couple of decades found that the clearance rate was only 51%. That means that we are spending a vast amount of money to make sure we're giving a few people the strictest amount of punishment while actually letting the majority of criminals go. That's not a smart or tough on crime system. That's really foolish. And we've seen in regions that have actually repealed the death penalty or that use it much less frequently, they actually have lower homicide rates, whereas regions of the country, particularly the South that uses this death penalty the most, they have very high homicide rates. And I think that ties in very closely. So this is actually something that's not only not a deterrent, but it makes us less safe as well.
Is there anything, does anybody have a mea culpa when the government does wrongfully condemn someone to death? I'd like to think that, besides just if a moratorium on the death penalty were to be achieved, is there something that could be done on the part of prosecutors who wrongfully took another person's life?
Mm-hmm. Currently, no. You have a lot of immunity when it comes to prosecutors, and there's not a lot of punishment, even when they are proven to have violations. They're frequently allowed to continue prosecuting. I think one case that stands out in particular to me is the case of Curtis Flowers in Mississippi. And this is a guy that has been tried 6 times for capital punishment by the same prosecutor. The case continually gets thrown out in the appeals process because the prosecutor has had several Brady violations and other types of misconduct. And yet all that happens is the prosecutor gets to try the case again, spend more money, and pull the same shenanigans. So there really isn't a lot of recourse or any sort of accountability within the system. And I think that's obviously highly problematic.
Hannah, as we've worked here in Utah on trying to reform this issue, one argument we've come across is that having the death penalty is important for victims. We should give thought to how the victims feel, and they want this sense of closure and accountability. So I'll just ask you straight up, and I may share a thought or two after of my own. Should the death penalty exist to make victims, feel better or a sense of justice or what have you about what happened to their loved one?
Sure, and I love that you bring this up because I think it should always be at the forefront of these conversations. It's very important to consider what victims and their family members have gone through. However, the idea that we are doing this for the victim is also problematic. I've had the ability to work with a lot of victims' family members who have been through the system, and while not all victims' family members come out feeling the same way, a lot of them go through this system and come out the other end saying, I wish this had never happened to my family. This was awful. It drug us through the mud for decades. We did not get any sort of closure. We were constantly having to go back in and face this person and relive the worst moment of our lives. And it was a verdict that today was neither swift nor sure. So they don't really get a lot out of this system. And while they're going through it, they continually are having to keep that wound open versus being able to heal. Personally, I think there are a lot better services we could be giving victims' family members that I think would do a lot more for them in the healing process, such as access to counseling services, relocation fees when that might be necessary, money for time away from work they might have to take, things of that nature that I think would actually give them the tools that they need to deal with the trauma they've incurred. Right now, we just have a very broken system. It divides families. We've seen many families want the death penalty on one side, and the other side of the family doesn't want the death penalty. Oftentimes, when you're dealing with a homicide, there are family members involved who might be the defendant. So you're having to deal with someone maybe having lost their mother, and now they're watching their father go through a death sentence. And so I think that it's a very divisive system that I don't really see any evidence of providing actual services for victims, and many of them seem to agree.
And it seems to me that when you go through the death penalty process, because of its finality in killing somebody, that defendant is offered, I should say, many opportunities for appeal to ensure, so far as is possible in a fallible system full of humans, that the person is indeed guilty of said heinous crime. And because of that protracted appellate process, because these court battles go on, the victim has to sit and confront this individual time and again. The media loves these stories because, they get lots of eyeballs and clicks. And so the alleged killer, is turned into a celebrity while the victim's family members sit there in relative obscurity. And that wound is constantly reopened. They're having to deal with the issue time and again. They're having to constantly relive the experience and hear them again publicly. I guess, resonate a lot more with the victim's family members who instead prefer life without parole, because we don't turn the guy or the woman into a celebrity, the alleged killer or the convicted killer. We don't turn them into a celebrity. We don't afford them a protracted public process. We lock them away upon conviction, and we throw away the key. And the individual the relative, the friend of the victim can have closure. They can move on knowing that person is, rotting in a cell somewhere. And the thing I like most about that, Hannah, is it circles back towards the beginning of the conversation, and that is, in all these cases where these victims' family members are seeking retribution or accountability or justice, whatever you want to call it, and if indeed they do succeed in killing that individual, it turns out in some of these cases that they were wrong and the prosecutors were wrong and that person was innocent and they had the wrong guy all along. So the reason why I like life without parole is the sense of finality, lock the person up, move on with your lives. But then in the off chance where that person was indeed innocent of their crime, if DNA evidence or other corroborating evidence later comes out to exonerate that individual, they're still alive, right? You can rescue them and set them free, whereas under a system of execution, you can't.
That's exactly right. And Ray Crone, who was the 100th person exonerated from death row, he was actually convicted in Arizona for a crime he did not commit. And he tells a really powerful story about when his conviction was overturned. The mother of the victim, who had lobbied hard for him to get the death penalty and had said some, very awful things to him, which were deserved in his opinion at the time, just because she was under the impression he had done this. But she was distraught. And just came up to him bawling and crying and just beside herself with the thought that she could have been partaking in killing an innocent person and how wrong. She said, we thought that it was for sure you. They told us there was no way it wasn't you. And And I think that always has stood out to me, that we're asking people to participate in this system where frequently they don't actually have all the information in front of them, and they're very emotional, and they've endured a lot of trauma. And so we're putting the death of another person on people who aren't really capable of even processing that at that time a lot of the time. And not to mention what we're also asking corrections officials to participate in, and people who actually have to be a participant in the execution itself. Many of those people have since spoken out and talked about the trauma that they endured from having to partake in that. And I don't think that we as a country should be asking people to murder for us.
Hannah, is this a federalism issue? Is this something that should be left in the hands of the states to individually decide whether or not they'll have the death penalty, or would you favor seeing a one-size-fits-all approach implemented from the federal level?
As a conservative, I'm always a states' rights advocate, and I think that we're seeing really good momentum for this at the state level. I have to trust that states are going to do the right thing. We've already seen a number of them repeal their death penalties. We're down to only 31 states that have it. Of those, 10 have not had it really active in over a decade. We've seen death sentences drop by 60%. I think that we're having a real educational awareness on this issue in the country. And for the time being, I actually still have my faith in federalism and in the free market. I think that, not to mention, we're seeing a lot of the drug companies come out and say, we don't want our product used this way. And we have the right to say that we don't want something we spend a lot of time developing and bringing to market used to kill people. That harms our brand. That's not something we ethically believe in. I think that's a strong freedom of association argument. And I think that we're seeing that start to take hold in the court system. So I think that this is something that should be left at the states, and I think states are going to do the right thing.
Hannah Cox, National Manager for Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. We will link to your website on societyandthestate.com/114, and would encourage listeners to go read the report that's listed at the top about the surge in the number of Republican lawmakers sponsoring death penalty repeal. It's an interesting new trend that conservative groups are exploring. Hopefully this episode has been enlightening, at least in kind of exploring some of these topics. We'll also link to a policy brief that we here at Libertas did on the issue in case you'd like to go a little deeper, learn a little more. Hannah, hopefully people will check out your website. Thanks for all the work, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you both for having me. It was great being here.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.